the scene. He's got the voice that's mean, asking those questions that you never seen. He's got that fire, burning bright and clean. Andrew Keen making waves, break the routine on the Keen on show. He brings the heat, asking the minds, digging deep till they bleed. No sugar-coated truths, no lies to deceive. Andrew Keen, the master of the interview beat. He's got the knowledge, he's got the flair, challenging ideas with a fearless stare. With every question, he's uncovering what's there. Andrew Keen, a truth seeker, he's aware.
We are on the road today in Kenosha, Wisconsin, halfway appropriately enough between Milwaukee and Chicago for the Braver Angels Convention, trying to establish some civic understanding in America. One of the keynotes at Braver Angels is my guest today, Ann Snyder. She's the editor-in-chief of Comment, and someone very much focused on the moral condition of the United States. Anne, welcome to Keen On.
Thank you very much. Good
Easy question, Anne, to begin, kicking you off. What's the moral state of America in 2024?
Probably not very good, at least in terms of what we hear at a national level. It feels we're in our public atmosphere seems highly over-politicized and under-moralized, and I think a lot of people feel deeply isolated and lonely, and yet have moral yearnings that they're channeling, often in unhealthy ways, whether you want to say totally channeling it through politics or through more sort of extremist movements that explain, I think, very understandable feelings of chaos in a late modern era. But yeah, I think at a broad level, we are in a moment of curling inward towards self-preservation and more self-centeredness, not a sense of other-centeredness. But that's at a national level. There's thankfully millions of exceptions in much more local, human-scaled communities all over the place, and I think that's just, the constant hope of what it is to be human.
And I'm intrigued by the way in which you contrasted the moral state and the political state. You say that America is over-politicized and therefore under-moralized. Do those two things always go together? The more politicized the society, the less moral, and vice versa?
It's a good question. I think as someone who has always struggled to pair, say, the ethics of love with the ethics of power, I dispositionally feel like that's a correlation that tracks, over-politicization and under-moralization. But then the realist in me, I think, says it doesn't have to be true. Politics at its best is a competition between sort of competing goods, and a negotiation to try to find the best of those competing goods. And I think when you have morally fluent leadership in a political perch that's able to cast a moral vision that can unite a society, but also not make sort of the debate between goods purely technocratic, but have some telos at the core: the dignity of the human person, the health of relationships in a given context, a sense of equal dignity of opportunity. This is like moral terrain. And so I think if you have political leaders that are able to speak in this language and less of a purely win-loss sort of Nietzschean language, then you can have a healthier politics. But I would just love to see this happen between the politicization and moralization, just even at the very least in our public language.
Has this tension between politics and morality, between politics and perhaps civic virtue, has it always existed since the beginnings of the Republic? Did the founders disagree on the amount of politics and the amount of morality in a society?
They probably disagree, but I think they all, whether it was Franklin or Jefferson or Adams, they all understood that true freedom, which a democracy is tries to set up to honor and set the conditions for, that true freedom and the order of a society are premised upon individuals that care about virtue formation. Freedom depends upon a virtuous people, which by its very nature involves constraint and self-restraint and discipline, and things we don't always like to talk about in a ever more billowing, infinitely capacious, increase all your powers era culturally now. But I think that the founders, for some of the ways in which they were very, of course, limited and flawed in how they understood who deserved full freedom, did understand that there was a necessary relationship with, you cannot ignore, if you ignore like the virtue formations of citizens, then chaos will ensue and anarchy will eventually prevail.
You mentioned self-control. You seem to suggest, maybe correct me if I'm wrong, that for you self-control is the heart of the thing, that we all need to seize control of ourselves, of our appetites and emotions. Is that part of your worldview?
I wouldn't quite put it that way. I think we are, like, to be fully human is to be like full of all sorts of desires, but to also be fully human is to be enmeshed in relationship with others. And in some ways I would say a person is not an individual, a person is defined fully in encounter and exchange with others. That's like an anthropological fact, a physiological fact. I mean, neuroscience would now say we're made to connect with others. So if that's true, then there is a delicate dance between I think what it means to order one's desires and be given a framework within which to sort of put the breadth of our longings, yearnings, keep going? Okay.
Sorry, we're doing an interview here.
That there's always going to be a balance and a dialogue between like what it means to come into our full plenitude as human beings, but also how that has to be in respectful relationship with others with whom we would desire to have peaceful communion with and an orderly polity with.
And don't need me to tell you that America has had a turbulent history, from independence to Civil War, Reconstruction, New Deal, 60s. Are there moments in your view in American history that we can look back at, if not with nostalgia, certainly affection, in terms of the balance, if you like, between morality and politics?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not the only one who does this, but I wouldn't say I have nostalgia, but I take inspiration from the period between 1880 and 1930, which was, some would say, a similarly tumultuous period of great change in the U.S. demographically, waves of immigrants coming in, going from a more rural agrarian society to a post-industrial revolution urban society. And in that time, there were just a variety of players, some influenced by the social gospel, others who saw a need to blend, to like embrace the suddenly vast difference and fractious clashing of worlds that was happening primarily in cities, but also increasingly a little bit between rural and urban, and created a set of sort of morally formative institutions. So the Boy Scouts were formed, settlement house movement, boys clubs, girls clubs, YMCA, and so these, you kind of had like a bevy of civil society institutions that on the one hand had a set of national principles, but then were able to localize to the sort of smaller federated level and respect a local context. And so I don't have nostalgia for that period, but I look to it as some sort of a model that it's possible in a time of enormous change to create meaning-making communities for people that allow them to continue to grow towards competence and compassion, towards being a whole person.
Do you think then that the 2020s, or the first quarter, perhaps the first half of the 21st century, is similar to the period you noted between the 1880s, 1890s and the 1930s, when America transformed itself, for better or worse, between an agricultural, industrial society from a rural place to an urban place? Is America going through the same profound structural, economic, technological change?
I don't entirely know. I think we are much more aware of our global, like where we sit in the global universe in a way that was less true for the average citizen 130 years ago. I would also say we have we no longer have kind of a shared, what sociologists would call kind of biblical habitus, which is a fancy word for just saying like the vocabulary and categories of things like sin, transcendence, communion, repentance, like that sort of layer of those categories are no longer in common parlance. They're more sort of privatized into, religion. So there's just sort of a lack of shared symbols, potentially what I would consider like constructive symbols of covenantal life, are no longer there to help. And we're obviously in a huge technological revolution that feels, it may not be unprecedented in the scope of its dramatic change from one era to the next. But it just, I don't quite know what AI will mean. We're already at a very atomized state and very digitized, where we've lost a sense of embodied, like a desire to prioritize embodied presence with one another, leaning into encounter with one another. So I'm not fully answering your question because I genuinely don't know, but I do think we're in some hinge moment where a lot of tectonics are shifting. And I would probably date it a little bit more to, you could either date like the beginning of whatever era we're ending to the end, sort of World War II to now, which is like a 75-year period, or maybe we're just dealing with the same things that began with the 60s revolution, and we're just in some sort of twilight. So I tend to bracket whatever, we're in some ending, and I don't know what is beginning. And you could argue that a lot of what may be beginning out there are atomized, disconnected, disaggregated, emerging new kinds of institutions and modes of hope, but they're not cohered. And so a lot of my work is trying to figure out what is emerging that feels constructive for democracy to re-enchant it, and how can we cohere this together into a framework.
You use the Weberian word, re-enchantment. Do you mean it in a Weberian context? Of course, Max Weber was the German sociologist who invented the notion of disenchantment.
Yeah, possibly a little bit. I think I believe human beings have transcendent longings and have souls, and I know not everyone agrees with that, which is fine. But I think there is a deep frustration with kind of the mealy-mouthed, vanilla, government has processed only sort of technocratic way of understanding what civilizational progress involves, that people are wanting something higher than themselves, that like draws something of the heart out, that involves commitment and sacrifice, often something hard, and in all of that there is like a shimmer missing. People want to feel alive, and that happens in like deep communion with others. So I don't know if that's Weberian enchantment, but yeah, I do think we lack a cosmos. We've somehow, many philosophers, among the smartest of them, Charles Taylor and others, have noted we do not have like a shared cosmos anymore, and that you could argue. So you could say that's kind of a disenchanted, just material reality that ultimately sort of kills us just as human beings.
Yeah, Weber, of course, I think what he meant by it was the disenchantment with the world, sort of a loss of faith in magic, perhaps even in religion. America was founded, if not as a religious republic, certainly as a republic steeped and led and inspired by one kind of religion or another. I get the sense, Anne, from what you're saying, that you may be a little nostalgic for an America that used to be more overt in its use of religious language and imagery, or am I wrong?
I don't know if I'm really not nostalgic. I just don't think there was one perfect period, but I do think I think there are resources within a theological imagination and religious traditions that, say, if there was a golden period of like between the 1930s and early 1960s of kind of public theology, and there were institutions that that had some big players, Reinhold Niebuhr, Paul Tillich, Harry Emerson Fosdick, people who were speaking from a deep sense of the sacred out into public society for social use. That whole domain that I think can inspire people, can unite people, has been displaced by psychology and other disciplines. And I'm very, very grateful for psychology, but I do think it cannot explain some of the moral drama we each wage within ourselves. So what I would love is for all of the riches of what we know from psychology and other social sciences that have helped so many of us in our own lives. And as we, for instance, we often use the language of trauma now. We have these like new categories to describe reality. But I think it would be helped by also bringing back a sense of like cosmic sort of good and evil and human limitation and ways in which we're often our own worst enemies, and sort of a humility back. So there's just a different kind of calculus, that's a different sort of almost cognition that I would love to see raised back now with all these other wonderful developments that are more in the social sciences that tend to focus more on the individual. Because I do think and I'm not saying everyone should be more religious. I think religion is going through such a transformation right now around the world. But religion has an anthropological genius of understanding how human beings like thrive in the context of community, rituals. You find yourself when you lose yourself, etc. So I do think there is a hunger for the kinds of source material that allowed Martin Luther King Jr. to write letters from the Birmingham jail. And a lot of that deeper terrain, it's not taught in our universities for the most part. It's not represented in our media. I think there's often a suspicious ear towards anything theological, and it's hard, and it is also hard to translate now in a much more pluralist society where you have many different religions and competing visions of the good. So,
as I said, we're on the road here in Kenosha, in Milwaukee, just between Kenosha, just outside Milwaukee, between Milwaukee and Chicago. I drove around a little bit this morning. There are many, many churches in Kenosha, like so many other small towns and other places in America. Religion still is very powerful. For some, religion is the problem, very divisive. We've done many shows on what some people see as a fundamentalist tilt in evangelical Christianity. What's your take on the shifts in contemporary American religion, particularly the evangelical Christian movement and its support of Donald Trump?
Well, there's a lot happening in religion and around religion these days, so there are many stories to tell that are all kind of happening simultaneously. I think, so on the one hand, you see, let's just take Christianity broadly. You see, not just in the States, but in the West, European West broadly, you see, I think, a lot of people who are reacting against a sense of a disenchanted cosmos, or a lack of one, a fear that sort of like the West is losing ground, and they're converting, and I'm not doubting the sincerity, but they're becoming Christians as kind of a bulwark against, is it okay? People are converting to Christianity as like a cultural sponsor to sort of save a cultural civilization. So that's kind of happening, and you see it in Jordan Peterson, you see it in Ayaan Hirsi Ali, you see it in a variety of public intellectuals. You also see it amongst sort of a Gen Z, often more male, Zooming crowd. So people are turning to Christianity as a way of, I think, it's sort of a way of putting up some form of like control and order before a world that feels like both chaotic and rapidly losing, I think, losing its sense of any meaning-making forms. So So that's happening on the one hand. And then you have Christianity in the U.S., evangelicalism. I mean, I think that we're basically having a debate right now as a country, but especially within the Christian world, where, are we going to form a community that's defined by openness to its neighbors, or are we going to form a community that's defined by sort of dominion over others in the name of an ultimate truth that we're saying could actually equal the common good? And so a lot of, say, whether you want to call it Christian nationalists or Catholic integralists or various versions of those that are seeing, whether they feel a Christian way of life threatened or they see in Christianity sacred power to rally a movement that actually might be a little bit more around racial politics or a certain nostalgia for a prior visible civilization. They're using Christianity to kind of stir what I would still consider much more of like a political movement than actually surrendering to the person at the heart of that faith and following in his footsteps. So there's a lot happening in religion and politics right now. A lot of it is fraught and always explosive, but it's just highly complicated in the American context because of our history of civil religion, because, as you said earlier, because of some of I think ways in which there was an instinct towards actually seeing democracy as a fallen, but as an imperfect, but still the best vehicle we have to allow the imago Dei, like the image of God in every person, to flourish. Like all of that is very articulate in the U.S. bones, despite the imperfect way we have developed this story. And so it will always feel, compared to Europe at least, like a shockingly but confusingly religious country.
And so we have a problem. We've got anxiety, alienation, hostility, lack of civic discourse. We've been spending the last few days at Braver Angels talking about that. Do we all have Braver Angels inside us? Madison, of course, famously said that if men were angels, politics wouldn't be necessary. We've already talked about some of the tensions between politics and morality. But what do we need to do? Is it education? Is it more faith? Is it an internal process?
I think we need to find healthy communities where there is a real sense of, there is an invitation to deep vulnerability with one another and deep listening, but also psychological safety to be able to express your views and to also be able to share your own story that gives rise to certain, whether it's political views or other cultural views or fears about the future, etc. I think it's really a community problem more than it even is. I mean, I think we have some character issues, but character is formed invariably in the context of communities that have the conditions set for people to bloom into being humble, listening, kind, other-centered, brave, discerning when you need to make a hard judgment call. So it's a question about healthy institutions and healthy communities, and are we willing to commit ourselves to them, and if they're the least bit imperfect, to stick around.
Are you trying to turn America into a monastery?
I hope not. No, I don't think so.
What's the model then? Church, a community? You keep on using the community word. That C word gets used all the time. Sometimes seems to me when people aren't quite sure what they're trying to describe, they talk about this thing called community.
Well, I think I'm asking for people not to find a sense of community, which is a sense of belonging, a sense of being part of a broader whole beyond yourself. And I'm asking for people not to find that through a sharing of special interests or through a definition of who the non-community is. So it can show up in so many different ways. Of course, it can show up in religion, although many people would say where they go to church, for instance, is actually not at all where they feel most free to be vulnerable. It can be in micro-monastic communities. I just came back from London visiting a friend who with another family has set up an intentional community where they actually do share their possessions in common and do have shared ritualistic life and have a contract about how to exit if things go south. And there was something so countercultural about about that broader sense of being held beyond the nuclear family that was compelling, especially in an urban late modern moment. But I think you also, I happen to work for a really healthy, overall imperfect but healthy institution that has mattered for my own sense of strength in the public square. I think we all need, in a way, we need to be part of pluralist communities if we live in a pluralist society, but to then do that well and wisely, we also need to be part of what I would call non-pluralist. Not homogenous necessarily at all, not homogenous like racially, ethnically per se, although it depends who you talk to, and the history there of how you deal with strength and find your strength if you're a minority in a community, in a society. But where the primary beliefs are shared, we all need to be part of something like that as a reservoir to then deal with the wide range of spheres and political communities, civil society, your workplace, volunteer organizations. But each of these spheres of communities have different norms and contours. And, I think we need more of them. And we somehow, I think, need to be willing to, throw ourselves into more of them than, an easy internet age tempts us to think we need.
Is that one way of calling for a stronger America? Maybe not America, make America great again with red baseball caps, but suggesting that America can only fix itself when it begins to understand its own cultural, if not unity, sense of community. Should Americans embrace the idea of Americanness, or is this a kind of local identity? Nationalisms around the world are on the rise, and of course Trump has been unashamedly aggressive in his embrace in the idea of Americanness.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but I think it just depends how you're defining it, and I would love to hear a beautiful, coherent, alive, as in changing and growing, but there's some DNA that won't change. I would love to hear a fresh articulation of what it actually means to be an American, that is not based on some yesteryear image of a static picture that had a lot of sort of hierarchy of human value involved. So,
well, President Obama presented that, and there are progressives who are very busily trying to redefine what it means to be an American in the 21st century.
Yeah, well, I'm waiting for who can do that in a way that calls out our better angels and somehow that by their fruit you will know them. If the definition leads to a lot of anger and outrage and practically civil war, that doesn't strike me as the kind of America the founders envisioned. I'm waiting for someone to sort of articulate what is distinctive when you have such a multicultural democracy. And I think a lot of us are waiting for that.
And we're all waiting. I think it's a waiting for Godot moment, or moment, since it won't actually be delivered. Does it have to come and through politics? Some people look back again, I use the N-word and nostalgia, at Bobby Kennedy, maybe even Obama, certainly the Kennedys and FDR, and then more conservative people to Ronald Reagan. Must this come through politics, or do you think when America finds itself again, which hopefully it will do, it will be a movement that's not intrinsically or centrally politics, a kind of maybe a spiritual revivalism that exists apart from politics?
Yeah, I have decided, I think, that I'm not sure healers or even like prophets for the nation survive in politics, or that even these days, given how polarized we have become as a country, that the political perch is one that can be a uniting voice. That I think that was proven with the last kibosh with Biden, who attempted, at least initially, at least rhetorically, to be a uniter, and obviously hasn't happened. So yeah, I'm looking beyond. I'm definitely looking outside of politics to civil society, to sort of local weavers, to people who've been sort of demonstrating with a long obedience in the same direction, like really nitty-gritty sort of justice work, whether it's a Brian Stevenson or, I mean, there's many people I could name, but I've come to also think it's maybe not going to be an individual the way we saw in a less pixelated pluralist time, like the way we even saw in the 60s with a king figure or spokesperson. I think there's something that's going to be more, I mean, maybe Braver Angels is it, I don't know, but it too is still defined by the red-blue, at least explicitly, as its point of work, its fissure, but I think it will be a movement of people that are trying to figure out this I-thou thing of how can we once again see one another deeply and be deeply seen, and that will need some verbal articulation by an inspirational individual, likely outside of politics, but I think it's going to be some more nebulous, emergent grassroots uprising.
Should we be romanticizing the middle, and Braver Angels does by placing their convention in Kenosha, halfway between Milwaukee and Chicago? This idea of, well, if we can get away from the extremes, then we can re-find ourselves. Do you buy that?
Well, there's plenty of extremes in the heartland, just like there are on the coast, so I'm not sure geographically.
Well, symbolically, to find a place between the Democrats and the Republicans.
Yeah, I think what Braver Angels is trying to do is bring, I don't know how extreme they can get on the ideological poles, but they're trying to bring people to feel safe and comfortable and bullish, actually, on speaking from their most deeply held convictions, often in like somewhat fiery debate with others, but to do so in a way that this is held within the rules of a good debate. So I don't see it as necessarily just like settling for the middle that has no conviction, no principles. I think I think the whole country is actually at a moment not just of exhaustion, but hunger at the same time to see real debate happen on any given issue, and to watch differences be carved out so it's not just like a meaningless or a unmeaty civility kind of contest, which I would say coastally, and if we're going to talk about geography, like coastal elites tend to be very sharp in their condemnation towards the rest of the country, but also extremely polite towards one another, even if there's, some backstabbing and all the rest. I think it's important to not be condescending right now, and if you are trying to catalyze a constructive political movement, really here I would say to some degree a little bit of a spiritual movement, to just learn how to listen to one another again, it's much better if that's not coming from Washington, D.C. or New York or L.A. So I do think there is something about just going to where the people are, and not coming from on high.
Finally, Anne, I get the sense of an optimism, perhaps a quiet optimism in your part. Americans, of course, invented the game of baseball, and we often think of, when we imagine where we are in the game, in our narrative, are we in the beginning of the 5th, 6th, 7th inning? Has the game even started? Where's the American story in your sense? Is it just starting? Are we halfway through? Are we getting towards the end innings?
I don't know. I really don't know, but I would say 7 days out of 10, I think we might be ending, or we're at some denouement.
Civil war,
most civilizations. I have wondered that the last 5 to 6 years at points. I just still don't quite know what a civil war would look like, just given we're not in a north-south situation anymore. But we could see a lot of like pockets of left-wing militia, right-wing militia having political violence. We could totally see that after November. But I do still believe in the genius of American subsidiarity and a decentralized sense of hope and agency, where people are solving problems in their community, and you see this in creative ways all over the place. And I do think the sort of common sense of that middle ring of like a certain kind of neighborly logic working itself out is still part of the DNA of the country that could sustain us for another 100, 200 years. But we shall see. Most civilizations, I think, on average, last about 500 years. And technically, on that metric, we're just in the middle. But we'll see if we, it's not just resting on November. We'll kind of see what happens over the next 20 years.
Don't sound enormously optimistic, but perhaps you're a realist. If it is the end of the American story, what will America, and it's final question, Anne, what will America be remembered for?
I hope it will be remembered for being a country of immigrants and, two things. I hope it will be remembered for welcoming the stranger and figuring out a way to give them opportunity in a way that would not have been possible elsewhere, and like just a deep delight in cultural difference, and that we can somehow create a new story together, and that we have been morally alive. And by that I just mean the fact that we have been, not every social movement is necessarily one of enlightened progress per se, but the fact that we have been able, even through really bloody battles, to come out on the other side and reckoned with our own kind of sins as a nation, have some form of repentance, obviously very incomplete, and become a more perfect union. I think that like engine of growth and betterment is something that is very unique about the States. And its consciousness around that, and its desire to be growing towards some greater, actually kind of like transcendent map of goods that I hope will at least be known for having attempted it and have gotten some impressive way.
Well, Anne Snyder, I want to thank you so much for appearing on Keen On. I hope the American story hasn't ended, and we'll have you on the show again in the not too distant future. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
He's an expert.